depending on where you are in the world, good morning if you're on Eastern Standard Time in the US like I am. Good afternoon if you're like Benjamin in your most of Central Europe, Central European time. And good evening to those of you who may be overseas in Eastern Asia and Japan, Southeast Asia, Australia. I believe Ben's been based in all of those places variably over the last few years, but he'll have the opportunity to speak to that in our discussion today. Welcome to the book release party for Tomorrow on Cassette by Benjamin Duester. The subtitle is Tape Jams in the New Media Age, and it's out today on Bloomsbury in this very fine hardcover edition. Hopefully the paperback edition will be along soon. It's also available as a EPUB and downloadable PDF via the Bloomsbury website and also via Benjamin's website. And if you want to go ahead and put your website in the chat so everybody can see it. I believe everyone here had to go to your website to register for this, but just as a friendly reminder, you can look at more information about Ben at his website. Anyway, my name is Tyler Sonnichsen. I'm a senior lecturer in geography at the University of Vermont. And as you can tell in my home office, I'm also a huge analog person. And Ben and I have known each other for I want to say 6 years now, since the IASPA meeting in Canberra in 2019. And we very quickly bonded over our mutual love of analog media. I think we talked about cassettes. Cassettes probably came up within 5 minutes of conversation when we met at that meeting. And I'm grateful that Ben has asked me to host the event today. So just a quick overview of how this book release party is going to operate. The first half hour or so is going to be a discussion about the book, about cassettes, about Benjamin's research between he and I. And then around 8:30, 8:35 or so, we'll open up the floor to questions and discussion. Those of you who are in the room have access to the chat. So if you already have a question in mind for Ben, you're welcome to put it in the chat. Apologies in advance if I step on your question in the first part of our discussion today, but I'll go back through the chat when we open up the floor to questions. You're, of course, also all welcome and encouraged when we do open the floor to unmute yourselves and join in on the conversation. Raise your hand. I should be able to see your either your physical hand raised on camera or your electronic hand raised via Zoom, and we'll go in the order of operations from there. So while I pull up a separate window because I wasn't able to print this out in advance. So for the next like 20 seconds or so, I won't be able to see the Zoom window, but Benjamin Duester is a cultural sociologist working at the intersection of material culture, leisure, and sustainability. Currently a postdoctoral researcher at, oh goodness, my German is terrible, and probably because I may have been mispronouncing your last name, Ben, I'm sorry. At George August University, Göttingen. He works for the project Sound Knowledge funded by the European Research Council, which explores alternative epistemologies of sound and music in Oceania. I do have questions about that. He holds a PhD from Griffith University and is a founding member of the SHRED research network that investigates skating, sustainability, health, and environmental design. For SHRED, he is developing a zine called Green Pressure as Platform to raise awareness for projects repurposing skateboarding's waste in creative ways. And that's another one of many parts of Ben's research that I'm interested in learning more about today. So I just wanted to, I know Ben, I think Ben, you and I both agreed that we would have a couple of cassettes to share. Yeah. You can actually see, and this is an interesting feature of Zoom, the way that the resolution on the webcam operates, you can actually see my cassette wall back there. This is not planned. It's not like I positioned my laptop in such a way that you could all see the cassettes back there. But yeah, cassettes have been a part of my life for as long as I can remember. And I think there's a photo, I want to say, not to immediately make you regret inviting me to host this, but there is this photo that you included on preface page 12 of you as a young boy listening to a Walkman. And that was an immediately relatable image that I saw. There's all sorts of photos my parents took of me on family vacations back in the 1990s where I'm just sitting there kind of disconnecting from the world outside, listening to statistically Def Leppard or something like that on my Walkman. And I still have some of those mixtapes I made for myself at a young age. Is one of the things too, and I think Ben goes into a lot of great detail in this book in Tomorrow on Cassette about the interactivity of cassettes and the personality and the personalization of culture and the availability of what's the best way to put it? And I think Ben puts it much better in the book, but the accessibility of all sorts of different kinds of tape jams and literally called tape jams in the new media age. I just wanted to, just because I think these all kind of tied into either issues Ben talked about in the book or are relevant to what's going on in the world today. I picked 4, but I'll go through them very quickly, unless you want to lead things off, Ben, and share a couple of tapes that you think are worth worth everyone knowing about their existence.
No, no, kick it off. I got
Oh,
one
all right.
just to like introduce everything.
I'll try to get my part out of the way. I think there's actually a couple of tapes that aren't necessarily music tapes. This one I grabbed off the wall, one of my many comedy cassettes. This is by he's Los Angeles based now, a friend of mine from the comedy world named Dave Ross. His label, A Special Thing, put out this cassette of his comedy album from last year. It's called The Only Man Who Has Ever Had Sex, and it's just as irreverent and hilarious as you would probably imagine. And it's on a special pink shell. And I have several cassettes like this. Almost all of them were done by comedians in LA, and they were all done on variably colored shells. This one, which one of my other prized cassette possessions, I bought this at a zine fest in DC some years ago. It's called Macho Madness, Savage on the Stick. It's a compilation that someone made of tape recorded wrestling promos by Macho Man Randy Savage over the years. And it's one of those tapes that when you're having a bad day, you're not in the best of moods, you throw it on and it immediately picks you up. It's just pure, just like, I don't know how much actual materials on here, but it is like probably close to an hour of just Macho Man yelling motivational slogans at you and harassing Mean Gene Okerlund. It's amazing. This is one in a slipcase. This is actually a compilation that came out in support of, I believe, bail funds for people involved in the Black Lives Matter protests in Philadelphia. It's called 19 Notes on a Broken System. And you can see the artwork features the statue of Frank Rizzo, Philadelphia's longtime monster of a police chief turned into increasingly racist mayor, whose statue was torn down as I believe it was part of those protests in Philadelphia. And the reason I bought this, not just to support the cause during COVID lockdown, but it also featured a demo track of the Dead Milkmen song, The King of Sick. The King of Sick was actually re-recorded by the band for their 2023 album, but the Dead Milkmen are still, and individual members of the Milkmen too, are still putting songs out on compilations like this for various charitable concerns in Philadelphia. There's also a band in Philly called the Ramoms. It's 4 moms who cover Ramones songs. And there's a track on here they do called Gritty as a Punk, where they take pot shots at Sidney Crosby, who's one of my least favorite hockey players of all time. You can tell I'm a Caps fan, probably Washington Capitals fan for those of you outside North America and Europe. But the last one I wanted to share is this tape, which was actually handmade. I bought this near the Rostro. There's an anarchist market in Tirso de Molina in Madrid. I bought this in 2004 because I was looking through this. It was like a shoebox full of tapes that was compiling, in a very it was 2004, but it was still very 20th century style, a compilation of tapes that included a band called Sanity Assassins, which was my cousin's band from Connecticut from the 1980s and 1990s. And I don't know I know that there was an Italian label that pressed their records, but I'm not sure. I don't know the story of how his band from Connecticut, USA, wound up on this hand dubbed tape in Spain in 2004. But and I asked him about it, and he had no idea. So the mystery of tapes also is something that keeps me coming back to them as well. Anyway, Benjamin, why don't you share a few tapes with us, and then I'll ask you a couple questions about this book, and then we will open up the floor in a little bit.
Yeah, no worries. One that I wanted to share is one of the recent acquisitions. And it's, I don't know how many of you know, this is like for the Cantopop fans of you, which I'm sure there are many, but maybe some of you know that Jackie Chan actually also had a career as a pop musician singing quite sad Cantopop songs. And I bought this one in Taiwan, and you know, in Japan, for example, there's this whole culture of having like an obi, like a sort of like a belt around CDs and vinyl records, and sometimes cassette tapes as well. What you have in Taiwan is like this extra flap, sort of the J card is poking out the case and it folds around the edge. So you have this sort of like double space where you are not just looking at the tape itself, but you can also put more information here. I don't know, like I thought this was kind of interesting because I've never encountered this out of any of the DIY releases that I encountered over the years. And it has this, I have to show this to you. It has this like booklet, and Jackie Chan is like total cutie pie in there. It's quite interesting. I had no clue that he had this sort of career. There is a tape that is, and it's quite an important part of one of the chapters that I wrote. I think it's the last chapter I wrote before I wrapped up the book. And I have to say this with a bit of a trigger warning. I'm gonna mention suicide in this story. But there was this. It was the first year after I moved to Australia in 2017, 2018, sort of around that early 2018, I think it was. There was a gig for a place in Nambour, Queensland, which was called the Time Machine. It was sort of like a mix between a thrift shop, and downstairs they had concerts. And unfortunately, it closed down. And was hanging out with a couple of the people playing music down there. And I went upstairs, and you could just like during that day, you could just check out the stuff, and they had a tape shelf, and I obviously was immediately drawn to it. And there's this article by Philip Auslander. It's called "Looking at Records," where he's like talking about just like consuming these kind of analog media through looking at them rather than playing them. And he mentions this case of like a guy who's like obsessed with records that have his own name on them. And I don't know, like there was a bunch of tapes, and there was this really nondescript one. Like it doesn't have any kind of information. It's just like this dead TV channel, but it has a sticker on it which says my name, $8 and Ben. And I picked this up, and I was so confused about it. I was like, why does it say, like there were like, you know, VHS tapes and magazines, and like none of these had names on them. Like there was just this random tape that said my name on it. And I asked one of the girls that I was traveling with on that day, and she said, "Yeah, that's Ben. That's like, he's a friend of ours. He passed on recently. He killed himself, unfortunately, and his collection of tapes ended up in the Time Machine." And so I felt like I had to pick this up, and it sort of became a gateway into a rather obscure but nevertheless very intense and productive eclectic scene in Australia, which is it's surrounding a label called Breakdance the Dawn. And the guy who's running it, Matt Earl, he is part of this band. This band is called XX No BBQ XX, like the XX as in like straight edge, which is a sort of making fun of that, I guess. But it's sort of like clunky, noisy, free impro noise rock. And there is a very vibrant scene in Australia for that kind of like free improvised, nonchalant, no wave kind of music. And that was the entry gateway drug, if you want to call it that way. And I don't know, I just felt, you know, sometimes I pick this up and I'm thinking about some people call these obsolete media, but with the streaming service, you can't tell these kind of like anecdotes. They are bittersweet. This is definitely a bittersweet story, but I feel there's a lot of weight to it. And there's like something that I probably will remember for the rest of my life. And I don't really know if there are folders of MP3s or if there are streaming files or streams that are carrying this kind of weight. So I just keep it at that now with the tapes. Yeah.
It is absolutely a testament to like I think you write a good deal about this, but just the humanity and the ways that tapes allow people to communicate in in very intimate ways that even prior to that was impossible. Prior to the rise of the home recorded cassette was impossible. In fact, a book that I'm working on right now, a member of the band who similarly passed away over 20 years ago, did occasionally circulate like personal letters just recorded on cassettes that he would send to people in the last 5-10 years of his life, and many of those became prized possessions, and in most cases they're the only copy of those cassettes in existence, which again speaks to the level of access and accessibility of the cassette. So I think on the subject of tape labels, you mentioned your label Gravity's Rainbow a couple of times in the book, just because it's inevitable, and it's something that fed into your own personal investment in cassettes. How did Gravity's Rainbow start? Was it you or someone else that started it initially? And how did it lead you into this greater project, or was it the other way around?
Yeah, that's a great question. It started, my friend Thomas started the label, and he started the name, or he gave it the name because he had the book of Thomas Pynchon and he thought it was a cool name. But I think he hadn't read the book yet because it's such a, it's such a big book, and probably quite painful to read as well. But yeah, I moved to Berlin and he gave me this tape here. This is a tape that he had put out, which is a split between him and another guy, Steinbeis, just like a live noise gig they had played in Dresden, I think. And Thomas is in his 50s now, and he grew up as a punk in the GDR in East Germany. So it was an interesting combination of us both running a tape label, because my background with tapes is obviously like growing up with these kids' stories on tape that were quite popular, or still popular in Germany, like these sort of like detective crime solving adolescent stories. And him, it was quite the political context, because the only way you could get hold of like a Black Flag album in the GDR was through like a seventh generation copy of a tape that was smuggled across the border. Like there was no way, let's say there was very limited way or means to get hold of Western interesting and good music besides illegal tape copies. And that's sort of what he was reliving through putting out obscure stuff that he was interested in on tape. And I joined him, and we were putting out a bunch of tapes. It's like I just picked up a couple. It's mostly like free improvised and ambient stuff and things that we were performing at the time, noise stuff and so on. There's one grindcore tape as well from a friend's band. But there were these two things happening. So we were doing that, and we were playing the gigs, and we were swapping tapes, meeting other people in the music scene. We're also having like labels, like doing DIY labels and putting out tapes. And then there was suddenly this cassette store day was like mentioned. And every now and then, like I would see these like headlines, like in the news, for example, it's like, are cassettes the new vinyl records, or cassette tapes are making a comeback. The dead media is stomping the terror again. And it was like very cheesy headlines that I saw. And so in 2016, Cassette Store Day had a German branch, and they were hosting this like Cassette Day event in Berlin. And it was these two labels that were sort of more like in the indie rock scene. And it was quite I'm not trying to like bash them, but it was let's say it was more polished than the stuff that we do or did. And we were participating in like a market where you could bring your tapes and sell them. And it was such a confusing experience participating in this, because we were just standing there for 5 hours or so, and one guy at the very end, like while we're already like packing up, one guy came up to us and like bought some tapes, and those were like we sold like 3 tapes on the day, and the rest of the tapes we were just again swapping with the people who we knew already. And it's, oh, this is a new tape I took, like I released, like you want to swap? And we did that again, like just what we were used to already doing, like having tapes. I'm writing that in the book as well, sort of as this like exchange currency that you can use to participate in the scene. But then we were just trying to figure out like, what is this like cassette comeback thing that people are talking about? Like, are they, like, are people buying them now? But like, there's no like tape heads coming here. Like, this would be the ideal opportunity to just like buy tapes if you wanted to. And there was nobody. It was just like a meetup of friends basically hanging out. It was fine by us, but it was just all very strange and confusing. So I started like looking into what was written about that. Like, was anybody writing about tapes in that kind of like way, as a form of like DIY currency, or as just like part of the DIY music scenes? And well, back then, I had to consult mainly the university library. I was studying musicology in Berlin at the time, and I found 2 books. Like I found this one, Cassette Mythos by Robin James, which is epic, but it was not about the 2010s. This was published in 1992, and this is about the cassette trading cultures of like the late 70s and the 1980s. And then at the same time, I was reading this book, Japanoise by Dave Novak, and in it he has a dedicated chapter called "The Future of Cassette Culture." And that chapter was basically the only thing I could find about current cassettes, like current cassette circulation and like the significance of it. And then later I learned that that was actually from like 2007 or something like that. So like from, like 10 years before I was reading the chapter. So that was already old by that standard as well. So I found, okay, there's not really, as far as I was able to discover, not really much going on. So I had to write a master's thesis, and I thought, okay, that's probably a good topic. So I talked to the people that were part of the scene just informally, and I gathered information, and I made like mind maps, like just trying to figure out the connections between the venues and like the record stores that were selling the tapes and how they were circulating, and then what kind of relationships would emerge, what kind of rivalries would emerge just from using cassette tapes. And it was sort of like a first step into deconstructing this idea of a cassette revival. And then I graduated, and the next step was, okay, I want to write a book about this. Like, I vividly remember sitting in the train from the uni towards Alexanderplatz in Berlin, which is this place where the TV tower is. And I was reading the introduction. I was thinking to myself, I want to do something like this. I want to produce something like this. And it's really surreal to hold the book in my hands now and have this like confirmation, like, yeah, okay, I pull it off somehow. Like I produced something similar, maybe, hopefully, to this. Yeah.
And I think you have a chapter in the book, it's chapter 8, and it's called Cassette Store Day. And it's interesting hearing that now about how that was sort of like the early germ of this process of writing. Because in a sense, it takes you 7 chapters. It's all like very well constructed to get to that point where you have to ask about the long reach to the present of cassettes. I think another person who's published, I want to say last year, published a book about that element of cassettes, Rob Drew. I believe, and I think, yeah, the Novak chapter, I don't remember if I was, because I remember, I think I told Rob Drew about the Novak book about Japanoise, and how the way that Novak described the way that Japanese noise artists, some of them call themselves musicians, some refer to themselves as noisicians or noise artists, don't consider themselves musicians. But cassettes were essential to the circulation of that. And I think that that was, as a geographer, that of course resonated with me. And I hadn't, it was one of those things that kind of came into crystal clear focus around the time that you and I met, when I realized that there was research going on in that vein about the impact of cassettes, and how they had impacted the way that we look at kind of music, especially music fans look at the past as well as toward the future. Now, one thing that, and I started to think about how much I enjoyed your cassette store day chapter, because it's in the book, and I don't think they care about being thrown under the bus, but the band Scandal in Japan occupy a very maybe for those of us who are less familiar with Scandal and Japanese indie, what was it about them that made them these cassette store day ambassadors, and what was it about the event that kind of flew in the face of conventional wisdom about cassettes?
Scandal is an interesting band because they started off as an indie band, like a proper indie band, during the end of the 2000s, where it was quite common to have like a demo CDR. And to give them the credit, they definitely paid their dues. So they were touring heavily in Kansai and the area like Osaka, Kyoto, Nara. And they were building this like following of fans, and then basically they were successful to the point where they had the opportunity to sign a major, and then they got sort of introduced into this like whole circuit of in between being a band and being like an idol group. That's sort of like the space that they're occupying nowadays, where they are this hybrid phenomenon somewhere in between being a rock band in the traditional sense and being an idol group. And so Cassette Store Day in Japan is organized by a company that is specializing in importing cassettes produced in Canada from a company called duplication.ca, which is a company that many of the current like indie labels and musicians and DIY projects are using. They are importing this, and they are also specializing in vinyl records. So they are not like working on cassette store day in like a DIY community sense, but they are very like venture driven in this, more like commercial interest. So they wanted to bring in young consumers. And the first year they had this ambassador scheme, they actually used Hatsune Miku. Hatsune Miku is this like Vocaloid program that you can use to synthesize voice, and it has this like anime character, like this scrawny girl with long blue hair, pigtails. And they basically just threw that onto one of those cheap cassette USB recorder things that you can buy on like AliExpress for $10 or something, and then they accordingly price it up. And then the next year they did it with Scandal. So it was bizarre because Scandal, who up to this point they had nothing to do with cassette tapes, like they didn't release any demo tapes. They were the CDR era, so there was no connection there. I'm saying that, of course, during that time also people like in the hip hop scene and noise scene were doing demo tapes, but they were just not part of that, let's call it aesthetic, or that part of those genres where that was the common like the whole time. So there was no connection there. So it felt really forcefully like them being thrown into the space and suddenly having to promote cassette tapes. And part of the Cassette Store Day event, that was 2018, they had in Shibuya in the HMV record store, was like this talk event with a radio host, where he was interviewing them, and they had to basically like state all these reasons why they are suddenly like really into cassette tapes. And by the way, the product that they were promoting was like one-to-one the same cheap cassette player with their logo slapped on top of that. No cassette release of any of their albums, nothing, just this like player again. And they were saying, we love cassette tapes because of 13 Reasons Why, like this Netflix show. and it has this like touch of vintage, and it was just like all these like very it seemed all very artificial and fake, just listening to it from my perspective. And then I wanted to double check whether that was just my perspective, being, uh, the snobby cool kid that I am, or whether that actually also was resonating in the fan community of the band itself. And luckily, I stumbled across this fan forum where people were actually discussing the release and like them being included in this like cassette store day scheme in Japan. And people were not impressed by that. Like they were saying, this like whole cassette comeback doesn't make any sense. Like the quality is bad. Like why would people use them? And then did you buy the player? And then one guy bought the player and said, yeah, the quality is horrible. I'll just use it. I want to collect everything they put out, but like I'm not happy about it. And then others was like, yeah, nah, pass. I just don't want to get involved with that. So it was all very constructed in an interesting way, like analyzing it from the outside, and like talking shit about it is easy, but at the same time, I feel it was putting a bad light on the people who were using Cassette Store Day in Japan, because the thing is, it was in the beginning, and that's what I'm writing in the chapter. It was a really good opportunity for indie bands from the DIY scene to have their releases in the big music chain stores for a month, to get exposure that they otherwise would not have the opportunity to get. And then those kind of like really forced sort of advertisement schemes were putting them into a bad light if they were participating in that. It was like eating away the cultural capital, if you want to call it that way. So yeah, it was interesting for sure.
Okay, so I'll ask one more question and then we'll open up the floor to those of you in the room who have any questions for Ben. I was going to make a comment. I've actually forgot to mention this. The reason I grabbed one of the stand-up comedy cassettes from the wall, and there's several over there, is how for spoken word and comedy and just the level of accessibility that's necessary just for, I don't want to abuse the term starving artist, but someone who doesn't have the backing of a major label that has the ability to print the amount of expense and cost that goes into printing a vinyl record. Um, you don't necessarily need a professional mastering, someone to like master your recording like you would for vinyl, or even in some cases for CDs or some online release. You can just put it out there, and there's fewer obstacles to that. Well, the last question I had, and honestly, I have other questions, but I want to make sure to give others opportunities to ask. One point that stuck out to me, and this was in the chapter on the state of the cassette industry, is the exploitation of the cassette image. And I think that ties into what you were just talking about with the way that cassettes as a concept or an abstraction were used as a promotional mechanism for scandal. There's a photo that you include, it's on page 33, and I understand that it's something that you can't unsee now that you were working on this, is where you saw the cassette image used. And it looked like a way to sell coffee. Was
Yeah.
it? Yeah. Was there what was that general was there a moment that you recall where you realized, oh, the image of the cassette is everywhere, not everywhere, but the image of cassette is very abundant, and yet cassettes are still, as far as like the actual product, a fairly niche thing, but the image of the cassette is being used to sell everything.
I don't think there was like this aha moment. One funny and cute thing is that like once I had started the project, um, people would give me presents. If there's like a little wallet that is in a cassette shape, or like a card box, all kinds of things. So like on my shelf, I have a couple of those. So every now and then I would get these, and I was like, oh, this is interesting. One thing that I came across recently, actually, so on the internet, maybe some of you participating have seen this. There was for a while this interesting like new technology of a Walkman, which was like this sort of like micro thing, which would just clip onto one hole of the spindle, and that was, I feel like it was circulating online in a way that people would come to believe that this actually existed. But then I recently saw a video by the YouTube channel Techmoan where he was discussing that this was just like an artist rendition. Like this type of player never existed. And I thought that was quite notable for me, like because I was one of those people thinking like, oh yeah, that is something interesting. Like that's a new technology that is not just regurgitating, um, what already existed in the shape of a Walkman player, but just with worse hardware, basically, which is now the norm, unfortunately, in terms of cassette technology. But one thing that I can say, and again, this is me just being like an ironic millennial, but I wrote this little article in a zine while I was in during my master's degree. And I wrote about tapes, and that was just when like the 13 Reasons Why drama was like really peaking. And I was writing basically also about why I think that tapes are used in that drama, because it's a lot more photogenic and a lot more interesting for plot to have these tapes scattered everywhere rather than having USB sticks, for example. Like USB sticks are not sexy enough in that way, basically. And in the end, I just wrote, I don't know, I haven't watched the thing. I just read the Wikipedia article about it. It's something like that. But that's like sort of two turning points. That was at the very beginning where I felt like, okay, cassette tapes are every now and then used as this sort of token. In that context, it was for recording onto, which actually I think looking back at it now is quite interesting that they were placing cassettes as this recordable audio format rather than this just very limited, nostalgia laden item that you can like listen to and then haha, it's bad audio quality, it's hissy or something like that. Like that's kind of like one of the main things with the book that I want to bring across. Like that's a very, very small portion of what the cassette actually can do, just as like listening back to it. Yeah, I guess those two things stand out. Yeah.
Well, speaking of zines, thank you to Jerry for reminding me about Copy This Cassette. Blake Wirtz is a zinester from North Carolina who, and I think, and Jerry shared the link to Blake's Bandcamp, is one example of people who are using the zine format, which is another similar to a cassette. You press play and you don't have any way to manipulate the tracks on it necessarily. If it's you're a band you like or a band that you're discovering, a zine is very similar. When someone hands me a zine, I'm going to read every single page of it. When someone sends me a link to a blog, I might make it through a couple entries before I click to one of the other 13 tabs that I have open. And I think that you do discuss that in the book, is the power of the cassette is sort of an analeptic to the hyper information age that we live in. But that's one of many other thoughts that I have about the book and the greater project. So it's 8:40 now, so does anybody in the room have a question for Benjamin? You can feel free to, if you have your camera on, I can see you. If you don't have your camera on and you want to digitally raise your hand, you can go ahead. If you'd like to put the question into the chat, I can read it to get it on the record for Benjamin, but otherwise, does anyone have any questions? Oh, Andrew just put his hand up. Go ahead.
Hi all, how's it going? Two quick things on cassette visuals, and then I'll get to the question that I have. I thought you all might find this of interest. One of them is, this is my iPhone case on the back. This has been the subject of a lot of conversations. I originally saw this on the HBO show Rap Shit, where that case also appears. That's how I came into contact with it. And then one other thing about these cassette visuals and that image that you were just talking about, Ben, this was a wedding gift I received. I think this is like an Etsy type object, where on the back is a QR code to your wedding soundtrack playlist. And so this is even reminiscent of some artists releasing cassettes that have the QR code on the cassette jacket because people don't have cassette players to play them anymore.
Yeah.
So two things I was curious about is you talked a little bit about what's in the book. I was wondering if there's a story that didn't make it into the book that means something to you. And then I'd also love to hear your thoughts on independent labels like Sublime Frequencies, We Want Sounds, Habibi Funk, that are reissuing cassettes largely from the global south on vinyl now, and kind of how you view those projects. Is this part of like a cassette revival from another angle? Are these things doing something else? Just any ideas on those fronts. Thanks.
I'll start with the second question because I have to think a bit about the first one. Yeah, the Sublime Frequencies, Analog Africa, Awesome Tapes from Africa. I think Awesome Tapes from Africa is the first label that I came across, and I thought that was sort of true to the format because, as far as I know, he's focusing on releasing tapes. But I haven't checked on it in years, so I don't know if he's doing vinyl right now. But I also remember being in Portland, Oregon, where they have Mississippi Records that are also reissuing those. Like, I think there's also a lot of like old blues and folk music. But as far as I remember, yeah, Mississippi and Little Axe. So they are putting out these mixtapes as well, which are fairly low priced. And I thought that was an interesting idea in terms of like having a low cost entry point, like as sort of a way to get into that without having to spend so much money if you're on a tight budget. Generally, I always feel a bit conflicted about these re-releases in terms of like where does the money go from those sales? Like, are the musicians or their heirs, are they receiving the funds? It's sort of a bit of a black box in some cases, and in other cases, you know, people have been criticized for their practice. I think obviously being as transparent as possible is key when doing this, especially now that vinyl records and tapes to an extent as well are more like luxury items. They are collectible luxury items, mainly for the global north and industrialized countries. And also, I don't want to hate on vinyl records. It's an interesting question because I recently started to get back into vinyl because I bought this Soundburger that I can use in my office, which is surprisingly good and fun to use. And so I've been buying a couple records, and it's really interesting. I'm sort of just exploring like what the quality differences are between newly pressed vinyl and vinyl from like the 70s and 80s. And in some cases, it's appalling, honestly. Like, especially with this thing, because of the way it's designed, you can't play warped records. Like, if it's warped, it's going to start scratching on the bottom here, for example. And like the number of times, like it's been like 2 or 3 times now where I had to send back new vinyl because it was so warped from the factory that I could not play it on the thing. And that's really a concern that I have, where you have this amazing music, it's existing on tape, and then people want to push it into this like fetishized area of vinyl releases, where it's mostly things that people want to look at, which is partially what I'm writing about with tapes as well. You know, you have all these color variants now, and I personally, I can't get behind that. Like, in the beginning with tapes, it's fine because it doesn't really matter. Depending on what tape you put inside the shell, you can, you know, you can spray paint it. With the vinyl releases, I'm not sure. Like, I had a couple now that are colored, and I feel there's something off with like the way it's pressed or something, and it's just a bit strange. So yeah, I feel about those labels, I'm happy that this music is accessible and that it's not, you know, getting lost for sure. But my 2 takeaways would be, I hope that the community where this music originated can also get something out of that, that they can also get inspired, for example, make more great music. That the people involved in making that music, that they get the money that they deserve, and that they get the recognition that they deserve. And that it doesn't have to be only this focus on vinyl records or tapes, maybe, I don't know, like a diversified, like if there is like, you know, like a release that is like very synthy, I think it's warranted, and it's like from the 80s, for example, it can be warranted to just put it on CD, for example. It doesn't only have to be like vinyl, or it doesn't only have to be tape. I think this, like, you know, we can pick and choose nowadays. I feel that's like the liberty that we have, and that makes everything more interesting and exciting. In terms of the a story that didn't make the book, there's been times there were like conversations I had in Japan where I was basically sitting. There's an example of it in the book where a collector that I interviewed is talking about releases that are coming out through Cassette Store Day, but what I didn't really describe was how he lives, because how some people live with their collections, I feel, is quite interesting, especially nowadays where living space can be quite precarious with like short-term renting and stuff like that. But yeah, I think he has amassed, like, it must have been a couple thousand tapes, and he was living obviously in like a small studio apartment in Tokyo. I didn't describe that much in detail, but it was definitely an adventure, navigating that space and finding a place to sit, and yeah.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Andrew, and thank you for sharing those links as well. While Ben was just discussing that anecdote, I realized that you can all see this. There's a cassette in the. This is actually a piece of artwork that a friend of mine in Tennessee, when I lived there, he and I collaborated on a comedy show, and one of the I guess the episodes of the show that we did was called the mixtape, and I think it was each comedian on the show would take one song and kind of do like a goofy takedown of it, kind of like MST3K style, but for songs, Mystery Science Theater 3000, but for but for audio recordings. And there were no tapes to my knowledge involved in the show, but the producer of the show who made the poster, you know, he also felt that the idea of the mixtape was so central to the aesthetic of the show. I feel like I just had to sort of explain that because Andrew shared those two very relatable and very funny examples of the way that the image of the cassette has crept into many of our lives. And I also wanted to mention that I had a student on the topic of awesome tapes from Africa, and I think this does speak to the power of what Brian Shimkovitz, I think his name is Brian Shimkovitz, did when he was, I believe, doing a Peace Corps term in, I think, Ghana or Nigeria, somewhere in West Africa, when that project started. Last academic year, I was still teaching in my former institution in Michigan, and one of my students, a midterm I assigned for a class was where I wanted my students to ask. I asked my students, where has popular culture taught you about the world or taught you about important current events that traditional schooling did not? One example I used for myself was the 1992 Los Angeles riots. I was too young and going to a very monochromatic suburban school in Connecticut, so our teachers didn't want to engage who Rodney King was, why Los Angeles was as segregated as it was, militarized as it was, etc. So I used that example, and my students presented an incredible variety of things that they learned from popular culture. One student, who's actually an engineering student in the class, gave the class a brilliant 5-minute history of Hailu Mergia, the Ethiopian keyboardist who he discovered on Spotify through the Awesome Tapes from Africa like distribution. And as it turns out, Hailu Mergia, those and a couple of those tapes have since been pressed on vinyl by Awesome Tapes from Africa in coalition with a couple other labels. And Mergia has been touring and getting out there again now, I think in his 70s and 80s. And he was working for many years as a cab driver in the Northern Virginia area outside DC. He came to DC like many Ethiopian refugees did to escape the Deng in, I think, the 1980s, but those tapes were still circulating kind of outside the the overshadow of that government. So I thought that was where my brain immediately went when Andrew mentioned Habibi Funk, Awesome Tapes from Africa, and the value, even in varying formats, even using the internet to get those what were circulated tape recordings remastered and available to Spotify users. I thought that was a very powerful moment for me as a teacher. Anyway, with no further ado, Jerry mentioned that he had a comment/question. So go ahead, Jerry.
Yeah, first of all, hey Ben, good to see you, and congrats on your book launch. Yeah, more of a couple of observations. I'm not sure what my question is, but so I'm in Columbus, Ohio, and my favorite local record store, the owner always messages me when he gets in local or regional tapes. And it's interesting because I do listen to the tapes. I listen to them on an old-fashioned Walkman. But I write reviews for Blake's Copy This Cassette, and so I'll find out where they're, if they got a Bandcamp or whatever, where they can get it, people can get the tape. And just as often as not, you won't see the tape on their Bandcamp. And I just happened to get a couple just this week from a guy, and I messaged him through his Bandcamp. He said, "Oh yeah, I'm just trying to get my store set up." And the guy's from Boise, Idaho, and he was doing a tour coming back from having just graduated from Bard College and just stopping off at record stores on his way and dropping them off. So I'm really, distribution and how people get their work out there is of great interest to me. So I just found it really interesting that maybe to the larger world, a lot of these artists and labels, music is available digitally, but you have to be in the know, maybe go to their show, or they dropped it off at a record store to even know of the fact that they released a cassette. So that's something that's really caught my attention as I pick up more and more cassettes these days. I don't know, Ben, if that's something that you've noticed or maybe you noticed yourself or not.
Yeah, absolutely. There's some people use some interesting ways to appropriate Bandcamp and like the structure that it provides, because I feel if I went on the Wayback Machine, and just the general layout and how Bandcamp worked and works hasn't changed a lot in the 20 years or so of its existence, which is quite remarkable, like in the landscape of the internet, like that they basically had it figured out pretty much in the first 5 years or so of inventing that website. At the same time, it's quite rigid, right? Like you can upload like your release, and then you have your like streaming there, and you can cap it. You can say people are allowed to listen to this song 5 times, and then it's gonna block it and say, please pay for it now, or like buy the tape, and then you get the access to the digital files again. You can download them and stream them. What I've seen is that some people, because they have, well, first of all, there's sometimes a difference between a label and the band. Let's say there's a band, and they already put out the music and uploaded it to their Bandcamp, and then a label approaches them and says, let's give this the tape treatment, or like people talk about, let's give this the vinyl treatment, right? Let's put this digital file into the material world so people can pick it up. Then they put out the tape, and the tape gets listed on the label Bandcamp page, and then they link the Bandcamp page of the band. And sometimes it creates these like interesting sort of weird connections where you wanna find the tape, and it's a bit tricky. Other times what I've seen is bands, for example, forcing you to buy the tape, which if you buy it through Bandcamp, you automatically get access to the digital files, by making the price of just the digital file $999, for example, like some ridiculous price that nobody would pay. So that you are, again, like that you're forced to buy this tape for $5, so they don't have it in their attic or whatever underneath their bed. They can get rid of it, and you still have access to the digital content. So yeah, there's been interesting examples where I was also trying to find a tape, and then it ended up being part of some like distribution service or something, and I had to like go outside of the the Bandcamp ecosystem onto the website of like a record store and then order it, for example, or something like that. So I feel Bandcamp in and of itself, David Hasmanholz has written about it in Bandcamp in relation to SoundCloud. But I feel there is still, especially since the company got sold and they had a bunch of layoffs and stuff, it's an interesting phenomenon. One thing I think I write about that briefly in the book, Aotearoa, New Zealand, for example, they started to make these acquisition accounts from the National Library, where the National Library is having people sit there and sift through all the Bandcamp pages and sort out the bands from there that are bought and then stored in the National Library database, basically. So they have like an active acquisition interest in like saving basically the cultural memory of their like DIY music scenes, which I think is really, really cool. And it also shows this sort of like connection between, we have this venture funded business, which is Bandcamp, which is kind of like pretending that it's a music archive. And we have actual music archives and like cultural archives that are having to go out of the way to make these acquisition accounts to like, you know, bring this back into a safe space where it's properly treated for long-term storage and so on.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry. Nick has a question.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, I have to go and prepare for a gig, so I apologize for the brevity of this. Alas, it's using synthesizers, drum machines, and samplers rather than cassettes, but I've really enjoyed the conversation. Congratulations, Ben. I should say I was Ben's external examiner for his PhD, so it's been a delight to get reacquainted with the content. It's been a really interesting conversation. If I had a question, I suppose it would be about ethics and the care of the format. Most of my, I'm sure this is resonating with many of you here, but most of my experiences with cassettes as a listener in the 80s was that you knew how fragile tape was, but that meant you had to take extra care. You had to store it kindly, and you had to store it well. In a way, you had to sort of be, there's sort of ethics that comes with the format. So I wondered, Ben, if there would be any wider implications or lessons to be learned. I mean, if we see the cassette as a sort of moral agent here, what can we learn from it?
Well, thanks so much, Nick, and great to see you. Thanks so much for all your support over the years. The ethics and care. Well, I'm conflicted about that because in my experience, and the people who are older than me, I'm happy for you to completely disagree with me because you have 10 or 20 years more of experience dealing and fighting and being frustrated with this format. But now looking back at this period where people were using tapes, let's talk about the 1990s. So by the 1990s, the technology was sort of like in its final phase, and the manufacturers like Sony and Philips, they had figured out how to make reliable cassette players and hardware. Just think about what were the contexts that we were using cassette tapes in. It wasn't this like idealized context of keep it in a cool and dry area, right? Like everything has to be stored in a cool and dry spot. We were using the tapes in hot summers in the car while chain smoking with friends, I don't know, drinking at a party, spilling stuff over it. Like tapes were thrown around. They were heavily used. And so they were also abused in a way that they were given after some time. And obviously, most of them were used in the context of car stereos, which were not the hi-fi systems with like the delicate sort of like mechanisms that were intended for them to be preserved and like played softly. They were more like the bottom end and like, you know, affordable stuff that could also like added as an add-on into a car. Those were also the ones that were surviving the longest. I think Rob also mentioned this, and I think Mark also mentioned that this in his book, that the last car that came with a cassette player from the factory was like a Lexus in the United States. That was 2011. So it was fairly late that tapes were still in use in car stereos. And so if we think about using, just comparing like an external hard drive to using a cassette tape, if we make this sort of like experiment, this scenario where we are using them under ideal circumstances, my argument is, and I'm happy for you to disagree with that, but my argument is that the cassette tape and the information stored on that is going to survive the external hard drive by a long shot. There is this, gosh, I forgot the name of the author and the theory, but I've read that the digital media has this idiosyncrasy where when it dies, when digital storage media dies off, it dies off in a cinch, like it's dead and it's gone basically. Analog media like cassette tapes, they are wearing out and they get hazy and muddy over time, and you still have sort of like a time frame where you are safe in the sense that you can transfer it into another medium if you want to save it, so to speak. With digital media, I think the ethics for digital media actually should be a lot stricter than we are handling it at the moment. I think we are a little bit naive in that regard, what we're doing with digital files. With cassette tapes, I feel it's really also dependent on what is the composition of the tape, like how was it manufactured, and that is really showing right now. Like, as for me, talking about myself, I was treating every tape the same back then because I had no clue. But I feel, especially now that they are 30, 40 years old, you have to take each tape as its own personality thing. Like, it all has its own idiosyncrasies, and you have to work with those idiosyncrasies. And I feel that's also what people want to embrace as sort of a way out of the digital world that we live in our everyday life. Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Nick. I think, yeah, it's an interesting way to kind of frame it, especially since anyone who is into cassette tapes, actively goes out and acquires cassette tapes in 2025 kind of becomes a de facto archivist. And a lot of, and this is actually from my own research, working with band, I think it was the year that you and I met, I'd put out my first book, Capitals of Punk. And in that I did a bunch of research about the 80s writ large, the hardcore scenes in DC and Paris. And now I'm doing other like research I'm doing now is trying to look at the 2000s and early 2010s era. And I was talking to a bassist recently who joined a long-running band roughly in 2004, and it's fascinating because the stuff that zines that have been archived by, for example, the DC Public Library, there has been a very kind of increase in stewardship for those materials that were kind of initially thought to be ephemeral a bit more in the 80s. The idea of, oh well, I have this tape, but I'm going to play this Black Sabbath cassette over and over, and it's probably going to break apart in my in my Camaro's cassette deck or something like that. But the stuff that was made in the 80s and 90s is there. If it still exists and it's still accessible, then the physical elements of it tend to still be there. Same thing with cassettes and CDs and in most part records, going back to what Ben was saying. With a lot of digital media, like especially from the mid 2000s and 2010s, like my college years and early young professional life, there's such a compromised internet archive of that. And I think that also speaks to the greater kind of anxiety over how much of the digital archives have been privatized and kind of been used at the whims of a very small an increasingly small handful of very powerful, very wealthy people. And I think you did talk about that in this book, about the idea of ownership and the how cassettes kind of are an unquestionable icon of ownership for people who actually buy them, similar to now CDs for many of my students who don't like the idea of their music being fed at them by algorithms. And these are people who have basically been living in the algorithm for their entire lives, people who are 18, 19 years old. So there is definitely like a political element also, considering how much of the culture from the late 2000s, early 2010s was maybe shot on flip phones. That's like if you go to YouTube and look up, you know, a show by your favorite band from 2007, it's like a bunch of like pixelated cubes. And I don't know where I was going with that, but I couldn't help but think about that when talking about the lack of digital stewardship you mentioned, that the lack of attention or the lack of care being given to digital stewardship versus analog stewardship now. So that's my tangent about that. Apologies for eating up a little bit of extra time. Also, we are aware that it is, at least in the Eastern Standard Time in the US, 9:07. We want to be sensitive to everyone's schedules, but we are going to be in this room for I'm okay with being here for a while, as long as people have any questions or comments. Benjamin, are you okay?
Yeah, I'm cool. If there are
Okay. Yeah, we just wanted to make sure that everyone knows that, as Nick mentioned, having a gig to prepare for, depending on where you are in the world, you have either a gig you're about to go out to or a class you have to go teach, as I think Aaron, who was in the room earlier, mentioned. So we want to be courteous to that. If you need to back out of the room, we totally understand. But if anyone has any further questions for Benjamin, I have a couple of questions, to maybe concluding questions if not, but please speak now or put your comment in the question now. So I'll just read the question to get it on the record for Ben, which, by the way, the recording, this Zoom meeting is being recorded, but this portion with the audience Q&A is not going to be publicized. So the early part with the discussion between Ben and I, was that what you said, Ben?
Yeah, so
Okay.
people don't feel like they're put on the spot.
So Indigo posted a question in the chat, and then Ashley just raised her hand. Indigo says, I'm so excited for the book, as we all are. Keen to know what country you'd love to do a talk in next. I think that might be a little bit of an invitation.
Yeah, okay. It would be great to do a talk in Australia and just invite some people from the local scene, for sure. What country next? Well, I will talk about, well, it's not a different country. I'm just gonna do like a book talk or book reading here in the local record store in Göttingen as well in October, which I'm really happy about, that I can, well, it's a bit bittersweet because it's an expensive book, at least in this stage right now. But I'm still happy that I have something that I can take to the record stores and show people and say, hey, this exists. If you're curious about what is going on with this whole tape thing, I'm happy to talk about it, or you can read it. Yeah, with the opportunity to have it accessible in the near future. So yeah, I'm planning that. There's like another record store in Berlin that I want to contact, and then just take it from there, basically.
And I think too, the cost of the academic press in general, many of us have experience with this, which is ironic because the cassette is in a lot of ways an antidote to $28 vinyl record. At least in the US, $28 to $38 vinyl record, you might be able to get the same music on cassette for $8.
Yeah.
So like a paperback version of an academic textbook, which comes out, methodically, they come out much later, as many of us know. That will be the much more affordable version, and also the digital version as well.
It's also, I feel it's changing right now. Like I feel when I set up, like I was working in the project, it was quite common still to have like the, hardback version first, and like this whole thing with like open access, it wasn't really that big of a thing yet in 2017, 2018. I wasn't really thinking about like the publication and publisher at that point yet. Like I was writing the PhD thesis, which is the basis for the book. was concerned about that, but still, you know, having like the meetings with Andy and Ralph, my supervisors at the time. Yeah, I feel like this it was a fairly long era of how also books as a material format, as an analog format, have been working also in academia, and I feel that era also with AI implementation and stuff like that is coming to an end right now, or it's at least changing drastically. So yeah.
I appreciated the self-effacing comment in your notes where you said the trend among academic authors to post selfies while holding a printed copy of a recently published book on social media. And then you did that last week. You actually put the picture of that part of the text, that note, and then posted a photo of yourself looking super fly holding a copy of your book. I thought that was really funny.
Yeah, I felt like I gotta do a real pose of a photo for that, because I just, yeah, it just really played into my view of what I said before with this, like, we got to give this album the vinyl treatment to like elevate it, or we got to give it the cassette treatment, because somehow we want the accessibility of everything online and digital and at our fingertips, but at the same time, there's this longing for having something material. If I really boil it down, what I'm writing about in this book is about the human need for picking up a seashell at the beach as a memento, as a nice thing, or like a nice pebble that you found during like a hike during the mountains or something like that. Like, I feel that there's this famous example of the Makapanskat pebble, which is a pebble that sort of has the rudimentary shape of a face. And people are sort of theorizing that it was taken from the place where these type of rocks are originating and like displaced by humans because of the way it looks. And that kind of, I feel that kind of like desire in humans, cassettes are one example of that, but I feel that kind of desire, that kind of itch is very deep inside of us. And I feel the internet and digital technology has not yet achieved to really satisfy that desire. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Ashley, thank you for your patience.
Yeah, no worries. It was cool to hear Ben speak a little bit more on that. It was the question I really had is actually something that you just said like 10 minutes ago, maybe. And it was about the playlist and the algorithm. And you mentioned that your students don't really like it. And I'm curious, I don't know anything about that. So I'd like to ask you to elaborate more on that, because I'm on the other side of that generation where I very much appreciate the algorithm, because I'm not very good at finding new music, and I like a little bit of everything. So I find the algorithm time saving in a way. And I end up learning more about the artist rather than less, because there's so much music out there. I feel a little overwhelmed. So I'm curious about the students that don't, or the young people that don't like the algorithm. What does that mean, and what are they, I don't know, going up against?
Well, I can address the question just because I made the comment about my students, and then I'll kick it back to Ben, because I think that there's a lot in the book that talks about the future of the cassette as even if like, and I think a lot of it, how it's looked at by people who didn't have the opportunity to engage with cassettes when it was one of the choice formats back then. But for just to elaborate on what I said about my students, that's the sample set that I had was a class that I taught. I think it was a class of 17 students at the University of Vermont about the geography of popular culture. And this was a couple of different students who had expressed this. I think it's kind of a growing discontent for, with an awareness of the limitations of social media. For those of us, for example, who were on Facebook in 2004 and seeing how dysfunctional Facebook has become, I don't know how many people the algorithm allowed to see the graphics Benjamin put together and shared on. Did you share them on Facebook?
Some of them, yeah, I think. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think that the possibilities or like the opportunities that it presented is something that there are definitely a good number of my students are very aware and very skeptical of that. It's not a wholesale kind of like disregard, I would say, of any of my individual students for, you know, the algorithm as an abstraction. But I think that for students who are going to take a class on popular culture, like one student who is a senior who was in the class this semester, mentioned that her favorite artist of all time is Jimi Hendrix. And that's which of course for someone my age, like Hendrix was this abstraction that showed up as like, hey, boomer parents, baby boomer parents, here's a collection of 18 rearranged Jimi Hendrix songs on Time Life CD that you can buy and remember your glory years. And so that engagement with an artist like Jimi Hendrix, for example, this particular student said that they obviously were drawn into Jimi Hendrix because Hendrix was everywhere as an abstraction for a very long time, but also the ability to go on YouTube. Just like with me, I saw a video of Jimi Hendrix playing Voodoo Child in Hawaii that circulated. I think it was because of Criterion or some public media organization, and that made me a fan. Like I wasn't really into Hendrix much growing up, even in college, and then seeing that video on YouTube with a streaming video platform, that was what made me realize, oh, this guy was amazing. And then I kind of reevaluated my interest in his records. But I think that especially for students that may have found artists through, if not their parents, through streaming platforms. And again, this is also a sociological thing too, because, and I'm going on and on about this, sorry, because it's something that I care about deeply. But, you know, I think for my Benjamin's reference being a millennial, I'm like an elder millennial / young Gen Xer at heart, where you grew up at a time where you hated your parents' music and your parents hated your music. And for college students now, especially like the love that Zoomers have for Fleetwood Mac, specifically Stevie Nicks, but Fleetwood Mac's music, you can't keep Rumors. They keep pressing more copies of Rumors, and you cannot keep them on shelves at record stores. So I think a lot of people who are students now grew up with parents that were more engaged with their music, and they were more engaged with their parents' music, and social media platforms and algorithms made it possible for them to do those discoveries on their own in some cases. So to answer Ashley's question from my perspective, my sample size, of course, was different. If I were to teach a class like with like 100 students on a topic like economics, I wouldn't expect that there would be this deep engagement or critical engagement with algorithms, at least not in the way that we did in looking at popular culture. But there is absolutely an awareness that I think older people tend, you know, myself and people older than me included, tend to sort of take for granted about the youth today. And I think that when you grow up only kind of knowing one type of engagement with media, the stuff that existed or was available to people older than you becomes fascinating. And that was certainly the case for me and for many people, I think, in their 30s and 40s, with, you know, as demographically kind of pushing the vinyl revival. So yeah, no, as you can kind of tell, I don't really have a fully formed answer to Ashley's question, other than I was always fascinated in hearing what students had to say about the idea of, hey, you know what, I'd like to hear that Bruce Springsteen album in the order that the tracks were meant to be listened to. I'd like to listen to that Jimi Hendrix record in the order that Hendrix and the Jimi Hendrix Experience wanted people or expected people to listen to them, because Hendrix he's been dead now for over 50 years. He has no ability to impact the way that his music's heard. So there's maybe an idea of being respectful to the artist. So, but anyway, please carry this torch and bring it to higher ground, Ben.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Just the record I pulled off the shelf, this is like one of those collections, right? Like, which is ticking all the stereotypical boxes with like Dolce Vita references, and it's just like a 60s sort of like stuff that they would promote. It says here from TV advertisement and radio advertisement. And this is also what I remember seeing on TV, basically, these sort of collections. What I'm writing about, and what I've found over the years is that this like sort of consumption is diversified, and that's really what I'm trying to argue for, is that cassettes are not like, they're neither outdated, they're neither a good way to replace streaming, because that's, nobody really wants to do that. People enjoy like the convenience of having the algorithm, but when they want to, like having still this choice of deciding, I think today I don't want to listen on my computer. I rather want to listen on my hi-fi stereo. And if you transfer it to other portions of life, it's a bit of a stretch, but you have this phenomenon of like classic cars, for example, right? People have like a daily driver, and they have a classic car that they reserve for like a special occasion when friends are over and they, you know, the weather is nice and stuff. On a smaller scale, a vinyl record could be something like that, or a cassette tape could be something like that, where they are, you know, friends are over for dinner and it's, oh, I'll throw on a record, or I'll put on this tape. It's a nice experience handling that, and I don't want to have my laptop on the shelf right now, you know, my dirty, grimy laptop from work, for example, in my case. So yeah, with the young generation, I feel there is, obviously they are confronted, what Tyler mentioned, with these like symbolisms of cassette tapes, for example, where it's always put into this space of like being this 1980s retro item. And in some cases, you know, there are these like, I talked a bit about or wrote a bit about these memes that are created from like a baby boomer perspective, where it says like, there's like a picture of a Walkman and it says, if she doesn't know what this is, she's too young for you. Or our kids will never understand the relationship between a pencil and a cassette tape. And I feel these kind of like perspectives and memes are discrediting the young generation, because they have very easy access to learning about technology, old technology, new technology, that, for example, I did not have, in terms of like finding the, you know, when I was growing up, it was forums, and you had to find the right forum for that. Nowadays, you probably, when you're a Gen Z person, you're already on Reddit, and you are discovering this thing, cassette tape and tape decks, and you want to find out like what's a good tape tech to get. So you can go on r/tapes or tape decks or whatever on Reddit and just start reading. That kind of like access to information, and like also information on how to maintain this technology and how to repair it, which is a big problem, obviously, where to source replacement parts from. I feel people are making heavy use of the internet for that, and I feel it's not gonna like turn into like a sort of reactionary dynamic where people are just outright reject the internet, and it's going to be sort of like a either or decision making. I feel some artists obviously are playing with that, where they are just putting out a tape and they're completely like removing all their output from the internet, making it like intentionally obscure. It's quite common in like the black metal scenes and like some like experimental electronic music. They want to be like, you know, obscure and create these also collector's items. But I like in the larger picture, I feel there is more like a selective embrace of all the avenues that are available nowadays, where people are really interested in like, I wanna select the way I discover new music, for example, and I want to select the way I consume media on my own terms, which is getting perhaps more important. But I feel, yeah, because we are so used to being exposed to music online, if maybe it's a bit of a stretch again, but a comparison could be, you know, tap water is very important for us. I mean, you know that, for example, in FSM, right? If there's no tap water available, suddenly you take it for granted in a continental context. but then it can become very important suddenly. Using something like tapes is a way to just give music back that sort of like special character, that it's like this a little bit mysterious phenomenon where you have this like mechanism and it's like spinning, and that's my impression, you never really completely understand like how this music is coming out of this like spinning thing right now. And that's kind of like this maybe childlike experience that you can retrieve through engaging with this technology that is a bit lost through streaming and these things that we are exposed to on a daily basis.
That's very, I think that the aspect of choice seems to encapsulate all of that people are wanting to have more of a choice in their life rather than something given to them. And it also makes me think about, from an anthropological perspective, that we can't boil people down to an algorithm. And there are more nuances to an individual and a group of people than an algorithm. An algorithm would address most things, but maybe not all things. And so there's this other human component to choice making, right? To decision making outside of an algorithm. So that's very interesting. Very interesting, Ben. Thank you so much for talking more about that. Very cool.
Thanks for your question. Just one thing I want to say about the algorithm. Like, I switched from Spotify at one point to Apple Music, and I just noticed how this like suggesting mechanism, how different that is, and how, at least at that point, it was much worse on Apple Music, because for some reason it just thought I just want to listen to Sonic Youth 100% all the time. Like, every song that was queued up after a random selection, it was just this one song for some reason. And yeah, that did not happen on Spotify before. So there's huge differences between those streaming services, I feel.
Oh yeah, 100%. I mean, the research, I'm more familiar with Spotify. The research that went into building the algorithm for Spotify, from my perspective, is far superior compared to the experience with Apple. It's almost like they had a team of anthropologists, psychologists, sociologists working on the algorithm, and they told the coder what they want, and it's very adaptive code. So I'm actually really impressed with Spotify so far. I have it's not done something like that to me yet. That doesn't mean it won't, but yeah, an Amazon. I mean, I can't. It doesn't even compare from my perspective, of course. I mean, I think there's a little bit of a personality association with each of the streaming services and what you expect in your daily life. So definitely something to think about. Very cool. And congratulations on your book.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ashley. And thank you, Andrew, too, for sharing Jen Pelly's book, Mood Machine, which was, we're a couple decades, effectively a decade and change into the Spotify era, as it could be termed. And I actually am in the middle of Mood Machine right now. And finding out that Daniel Ek is the same age as me blew my mind wide open. I feel like media mogul, I still kind of have that image in my head of like old cigar chomping guy who doesn't actually care about the art. Daniel Ek is the same age as me, and that is kind of terrifying in a way. But I also grabbed this. Apologies for running over to my tape wall. But when you talked about, this is Ghost, which is Dungeon Doom synth, and it's one of many genres that I think has used the cassette pretty effectively. Even though most of the music is available online, I can't remember the name of the Forsaken Relics and Out of Season are two of the labels on this. And oh, sorry, I live in you can hear there are fighter jets flying over me right now, and it's terrifying. It's just this is like a weekly occurrence here in Burlington, Vermont, where I live. There's an airfield not far from here. So apologies for the noise, but really quick, I'll just ask. It's about 9:30 Eastern Standard Time right now. Oh, it's so loud in my house right now. Sorry. Just to, I guess, lead us to our conclusion. Last year, I believe it was, you posted an article, or you published an article, Ben, about misconceptions of the cassette revival. And I think it's important for us to put quotes around the idea of a cassette revival because there's a lot of nuance as you've done a lot of research on. Do you feel like this book is, in a way, sort of an extension of that, kind of problematizing this idea of a cassette revival and throwing stones at a lot of misconceived notions about what cassettes mean in 2025? What would you say if your elevator speech about the importance of this book and why people should read it and what people should understand about the meaning of the cassette in 2025? Big question, I know, but I feel like it's a good way to try to wrap things up.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks for that. For giving me the opportunity to have the elevator pitch. Well, the book is, I can say, and this is me very personally speaking, like I put everything in, I spent 8 years and put everything into this book and the research that I could. Right now, it's an interesting experience for me seeing this come out into the world because in a way, it's outdated already. And I went into this project knowing that it will be outdated pretty much from the point in time once I finish it. And when you open the book, I start off the book itself with this quote from Carl Howard, which is from Electronic Cottage #1, a zine, a cassette zine from the late 1980s, where he's talking about that when you write about cassette culture, it's basically like trying to handle sand. Like it will always run through your fingers and it will always move on in a way where you are unable to actually grasp something. It's always just this snapshot of a certain time, which is, to an extent, I mean, it's like every research project, but I feel it's quite drastic with cassette tapes because of the ways that they are circulating. The inspiration and the motivation for writing this and making this project was largely due to me being frustrated with this idea of a cassette revival and taking this thing that is very important to many people and that many people are spending considerable amounts of time and funds on in their daily life, to use it to connect with other people, to use it to express themselves, to grow, to fight against things like depression and illness and stuff like that, to funnel that into yet another example of capitalism, like using something that can be marketed in a cheesy way. That was really bothering me. And the book is my holistic attempt at punching holes into that narrative and injecting perspectives of people who have been using tapes the entire period where they were considered obsolete or considered dead or considered gone by mainstream society, just to demonstrate and put a spotlight on them. So I also start off the book, it starts off with the preface, which is called Dear Cassette. And this is turning into a mini book reading, but my first sentence is, "This is not a love letter to cassettes. It is about 40 years too late for that." And that's pretty much summing up the book in one sentence, because I don't have to praise cassettes. I don't have to tell you how great they are. I just want to tell the perspective. I want to share the perspectives of people who get something out of them and who, like I mentioned before, use them for all these kind of different things, and to demonstrate that cassettes are multi-dimensional, that they are not just this like one-dimensional nostalgia item that has been, regurgitated for so many years. Like, I mean, this idea of a cassette revival is 15 years old right now. Like, just thinking about that is putting things into perspective, I feel. Like, for 15 years, pretty much every year, some news outlet has pushed this headline, "Cassette tapes are making a comeback. Isn't that great? Isn't that interesting? Isn't that quirky?" 15 years we've been experiencing that, like all over the world. So I just want to basically argue with this. Maybe it's time to move on from that and just like embrace cassettes for what they are. They are fragile. They can be reliable. They can be fun. They can be frustrating. They can be rubbish. They can be great quality. They can be so many things. But they are usually, when there are people saying cassettes are just that, there's usually more to that story. And this book is me showing more dimensions of that story, or more stories. There's not just one story, there's so many stories. And this is me trying to tell or show some of them, basically. That's the long elevator pitch.
It's an incredibly long elevator ride. It stopped at every floor. And
Yeah.
yeah. No, it's so difficult. It's so difficult when I know that's like the last question that I think anyone who just published an academic book especially wants to be asked, because there's so many different, every chapter, every case study has its own elevator pitch in a sense of why it's important to the greater story and what inspired you. So unless anybody else in the room has any last minute questions or comments for Ben, I think we've been on for about an hour and a half now, and like I said earlier, I wanted to make sure to be sensitive to everyone's time this morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you are. So again, just echoing what folks are saying in the chat right now. Congratulations, Ben. I'm very humbled and grateful that you asked me to host this event for you. It's a topic that's obviously near and dear to me. Analog media and the digital age is something that it just, I think the quote that you used from a zine, which I thought, of course, kind of case in point, talking about the importance of zines, that you start the book with, you start the preface with, the idea of trying to like carry sand or trying to hold on to sand. By the time you get to your destination that you're moving the sand, most of it slips through your fingers and you have to go back, and it's a living, breathing thing. So again, congratulations. And is there anything that you want the people to know about this book? Anything else that you'd like them to know about, stuff that they should check out?
I just want to say thanks, Tyler, for getting up early and hosting this with me. And thanks everyone for attending. It's been a blast.